Kazoo Switcheroo. No bones about it. By Nancy Krulik, illustrated by John and Wendy. Chapter 1. Ouch! Kazoo shouted. She turned around and stared at Kevin Camilleri. Stop kicking the seat. Kevin grinned at Katie. I didn't do it. George did. George Brennan was sitting next to Kevin on the school bus. The kids in Class 3A were on their way to the Cherrydale Museum of Natural History for a field trip. It wasn't me, George assured Katie. It must have been a ghost, Kevin joked. Katie sighed. I don't care who it was. Just stop kicking. As Katie turned back around in her seat, one of her best friends, Suzanne Locke, let out a yelp. George, keep your disgusting hands off my ponytail, she shouted. It took me hours to get it right. You're going to ruin it. You mean you meant for it to look like that? George asked. Suzanne looked at Katie. Boys, she huffed. They're all pains in the neck. Jeremy's not a pain, Katie pointed out. Suzanne rolled her eyes. He's your friend, Katie. Not mine. It was true. Jeremy Fox was Katie's other best friend. But he and Suzanne did not get along at all. Katie looked across the aisle. Jeremy was sitting next to Manny Gonzalez. They were making bunny ears over Becky Stern's head. Katie was glad Suzanne didn't see them. It would only prove her point. Hey, Jeremy! Manny! Watch this, George called out. He stuck his tongue out at a car that was passing by. How about this? Manny said. He squashed his nose and mouth up against the bus window. You guys better stop that, Katie warned them. If Mrs. Dirkman catches you, you'll be in big trouble. She's all the way in the front of the bus, George said. He looked out the window and stuck his tongue out again as another car drove by. Jeremy held up a camera. Hey, George, say cheese. George made a funny face as Jeremy snapped a photo. What was that for? George asked him. I'm taking pictures of our field trip for the Class 3A Times, Jeremy explained. He was editor of the class newspaper. Cool, how about this one? George asked. He stood up and held his ears straight out as a car passed by. Mrs. Dirkman will be really mad, Katie reminded them. George sighed. Kazoo, you're a goody-goody, he exclaimed. I am not, she insisted. You are, too, George told her. You never get in trouble. You never do anything wrong. You're a goody-goody. Goody-goody, Kevin repeated. Katie is a goody-goody. Katie is a goody-goody, Manny joined in. Katie is a goody-goody. The boys' chanting grew louder and louder. Katie's face got redder and redder. She was mad. And she was hurt, too. After all, Katie and George were friends. She'd been the first one to be nice to him when he was the new kid at school. And George was the one who had given Katie her way cool nickname, Kazoo. But George sure wasn't treating Katie like a friend right now. He kept on singing, Katie is a goody-goody, Katie is a goody-goody. That's enough! Mrs. Dirkman shouted from the front of the bus. The boys quieted down right away. It's almost the end of the school year. By now, I would expect you to know how to act on a field trip. If you children cannot behave, I will ask Mr. Bloom to turn this bus around right now. We can go back to school and have a math test instead of a field trip, Mrs. Dirkman warned. Suzanne looked at Katie. See, I told you boys were rotten. George was mean. And he was wrong. I'm not a goody-goody, assured Katie. Well, Suzanne said slowly. Not all the time, anyway. What's that supposed to mean? Katie asked her. Nothing, Suzanne said. It's just that you hardly ever get in trouble. I do, too, Katie insisted. When? There was that time Mrs. Dirkman read our note out loud. Katie said. We got in trouble then. That was months ago, Suzanne reminded her. And I was the one who sent the note in the first place. You were just answering me. How about the time Mr. Kane caught me with a cell phone? Suzanne laughed. Me again. It was my cell phone, remember? I brought it to school. You were just holding it when Mr. Kane walked into the cafeteria. Katie looked across the aisle at Jeremy. You don't think I'm a goody-goody, do you? Jeremy didn't answer. Jeremy, Katie insisted. It's okay to be a goody-goody, Jeremy said finally. Everybody has to be something. George is funny. Kevin is the tomato man. I'm good at sports. I'm fashionable, Suzanne added. Mandy's really smart. Zoe's an artist. And you're a goody-goody, Jeremy finished. It's just who you are. We like you anyway, Suzanne said. Katie frowned. Somehow, that didn't make her feel any better. Chapter 2. As the bus rolled along, Katie stared out the window. She tried not to think about what her friends had said. But she couldn't help it. Especially since George and Kevin kept whispering, goody-goody, goody-goody, into her ear. Katie wanted to ask Mrs. Dirkman to make them stop. But telling on the boys would only make her seem like more of a goody-goody. The truth was, George couldn't be more wrong. Katie had actually gotten into trouble lately. Lots of trouble. In the past few months, Katie had wound up in the boys' locker room, started a food fight in the cafeteria, and completely ruined Becky's report on Cleopatra. She'd also wrecked part of Mrs. Dirkman's prized garden. George would have loved to have seen that. But none of Katie's friends knew about the trouble she had gotten into. How could they? All those things had happened when Katie had magically turned into someone else. But Katie couldn't tell her friends that. They never would believe her. Katie wouldn't believe it either, if it hadn't happened to her. But it really did happen. Katie Carew turned into other people, a lot. It all started one day at the beginning of the school year. Katie had lost the football game for her team, ruined her favorite pair of pants, and let out a big burp in front of the whole class. It was the worst day of Katie's life. That night, Katie had wished she could be anyone but herself. There must have been a shooting star overhead when she had made that wish, because the very next day the magic wind came and turned Katie into Speedy the class hamster. Katie had escaped from the hamster cage, and wound up in the boys' locker room, stuck inside George's stinky sneaker. Luckily, Katie had turned back into herself before George could step on her. The magic wind came back again and again. It turned her into Lucille, the lunch lady, and Katie had started a food fight with some really gooey egg salad. The wind had turned her into other kids, too, like Jeremy and Becky. Once, the magic wind had even turned Katie into her very own dog, Pepper. That time, she chased a particularly nasty squirrel into Mrs. Dirkman's yard and had destroyed her teacher's favorite troll statue. Katie never knew when the magic wind would come back again. All she knew was that when it did, she was going to wind up getting into some sort of trouble, and so would the person she'd turn into. See? Katie wasn't a goody-goody at all. Unfortunately, she was the only person who knew it. Chapter 3. Okay, class, follow me, Mrs. Dirkman said as she walked up the stone staircase that led to the museum. Remember, we have to be on our best behavior. A tall, skinny man with a thin tuft of hair on his head walked over to greet the class. Hello. You must be from Cherrydale Elementary School, he said. Yes, we are, Mrs. Dirkman replied. Are you the volunteer who will give us our tour? The man quickly shook his head and pointed to a badge he wore on a chain around his neck. I'm the director of the education department, he said proudly. But the volunteer who was supposed to take you around called in sick. So I got stuck. So I got the pleasure of giving you the tour. I'm fitting you in before my next appointment. I'm going to give a very important scientist, Dr. Franklin P. Muffinstoffer, a tour of the museum. Oh, well, that's wonderful, Mrs. Dirkman said. We're very lucky to have you as our guide. You certainly are, the man boasted. I'm Mrs. Dirkman, the teacher said, holding out her hand. I'm Mr. Weir, the man replied, shaking her hand. Did you hear that? George whispered. His name is Mr. Weird. He said his name was Mr. Weir, Katie corrected George. I don't know, Kevin said. He looks weird to me. Some of the kids giggled. Mrs. Dirkman didn't. Children, she scolded. This is not how we behave in a museum. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Weir assured her. I can handle a bunch of children. Katie looked over at George. She could tell he was already planning something bad to do in the museum. Suddenly, Katie felt sorry for Mr. Weir. He'd probably never met anyone like George before. Can we go to the Hall of Dinosaurs? Kevin asked. I used to go there all the time when I was little. When was that? Yesterday? Suzanne joked. Kevin stuck his tongue out at her. We'll get to the dinosaurs when I say so, Mr. Weir said. We're starting with the Ancient Egypt exhibit. Do you have any real mummies in there? George asked excitedly. Mr. Weir shook his head. No. Those go to the big museums in the city, he said with a very jealous sigh. We get stuck with the fake mummy cases. But they look just like the real thing. Mrs. Dirkman assured Class 3A. Mr. Weir led them down a long hallway. The walls were lined with drawings made by ancient Egyptians. Those are called hieroglyphics, Suzanne told the others. It's sort of a picture alphabet. How did you know that? Mr. Weir asked, surprised. I know a lot about ancient Egypt. Suzanne told him. I used to be Cleopatra's biggest fan. Until I got tired of her. Then I moved on to Coco Chanel. She was a famous clothing designer. And now I'm interested in learning about supermodels. She turned her face to the side. Don't you think my bone structure is perfect? Mr. Weir glared at Suzanne. Is there some way to turn her off? He asked Mrs. Dirkman. Mrs. Dirkman sighed. Suzanne, right now we're talking about ancient Egypt, she said. Becky Stern had been carefully studying some of the hieroglyphics on the wall. There was one picture that really interested her. It was of a man standing on his head. Becky flipped over and stood on her hands. Look at me, she squealed. I'm a hieroglyphic. Becky! Katie shouted out, surprised. Get down. You're going to break something. Yes, Becky, Mrs. Dirkman scolded. Get down. We walk on our feet, not our hands, in a museum. Katie, you're such a goody-goody. Becky replied. She swung her legs down to the floor. Unfortunately, Becky didn't see that Manny was standing right behind her. She kicked him in the stomach on her way down. Manny fell backwards and knocked over one of the 3 fake mummy cases. Wham! Click! Jeremy took a picture of Manny, Becky, and the fallen mummy case. That's going to be great, he told Kevin. Mrs. Dirkman glared at Becky and Manny. It wasn't my fault, Manny told the teacher. You banged into the mummy case, Becky said. You banged into me, Manny argued. I told you this would happen, Katie reminded Becky. Be quiet, goody-goody, Becky said to Katie. She turned to Manny. You want to fight about it? Teed never hit a girl, Manny began. But in your case, I could make an exception. Is this the kind of behavior you teach your class? Mr. Weir asked Mrs. Dirkman. They're just a little excited, that's all, Mrs. Dirkman assured him nervously. She stood between Becky and Manny so they couldn't fight. Bam! At that very moment, one of the still-standing mummy cases burst open. Something or someone leaped out at the class. Ayaha! Miriam Chan screamed. It's a mummy! She headed for the door. As she ran, she stepped right on Mr. Weir's foot. Ow, he shouted, grabbing his foot. Darn kids! Suddenly, they heard some very familiar laughter. It was George. He'd been hiding in the mummy case. George, that was mean, Miriam shouted. You scared me. It was just a joke, George replied. Your behavior is not funny. Mrs. Dirkman scolded him. You want funny? George asked her. I give you funny. How do you make a mummy float? How? Kevin asked. Take 2 scoops of ice cream, add root beer, then drop in a mummy. George Brennan, get over here right now. Mrs. Dirkman ordered. George walked nervously over to his teacher. Apologize to Mr. Weir, the teacher insisted. I'm sorry, Mr. Weird, George said. It's Weir! Mr. Weir shouted. And don't you forget it. Chapter 4. Mr. Weir led the kids through a large open room. There was no one in there but Class 3A. It was very quiet until Mrs. Dirkman let out a loud scream. The teacher was standing in the middle of the room, frozen in place. What's wrong? Mr. Weir asked her. Mrs. Dirkman didn't say anything. She just pointed up at a massive plastic spider hanging from the ceiling. Mrs. Dirkman was scared of any kind of creepy crawly creature. A giant one like that scared her even more. What's that? She stammered. Oh, that? It's a model of a tarantula, Mr. Weir answered. Of course, a real tarantula only has a 3.5-inch body and a 9-inch leg span. This is an oversized model. We use it to point out all the interesting parts of a tarantula's body. Notice the spiny hairs that cover its middle section. Mrs. Dirkman kept staring at the giant spider hanging from the ceiling. I had a nightmare about a tarantula once. Mrs. Dirkman gulped. It didn't end well. As Mr. Weir talked about the spider, Mandy studied the rows of shelves in the room. They went from the floor to the ceiling. There were lots of fake insects on them. I bet I can climb to the top before you do, Mandy dared Jeremy. No way, Becky told her. Jeremy's the best climber in the whole school. She batted her eyes at Jeremy. Jeremy groaned. Come on, Mandy said. Let's race. Okay, you're on.